The dawn broke cold over the Wyoming territory, casting long shadows across Ezekiel Garrett's failing ranch. He stood at the fence line, counting what remained of his herd. 14 head of cattle. 2 years ago, there had been 60. His calloused hand gripped the weathered post as he stared at the barren feeding pens. The drought had taken everything: the grass, the hay, his hope. Behind him, the cabin stood silent, its emptiness a daily reminder of Emma's grave on the hillside. The bank notice nailed to his door gave him 60 days. 60 days to find money he didn't have, to save land he'd broken his back working, to justify why he was still drawing breath when his wife and unborn child weren't. Ezekiel Garrett had never begged in his life, but desperation, he was learning, had a way of teaching a man humility. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. The ride into town took 2 hours, the buckboard wagon rattling over frozen ruts. Ezekiel had sold his good horse months ago. What remained was old Buck, 20 years if he was a day, and a wagon with a mended harness held together more by hope than leather. Main Street was quiet for a Saturday. Ezekiel tied Buck outside the general store, his business with the bank manager requiring a clear head and whatever dignity he had left. But Reverend Morrison intercepted him on the boardwalk, his weathered face grave. "Ezekiel, a word, if you have the time." "Reverend." Ezekiel touched his hat brim. "I'm headed to see Coleman at the bank." "I know. That's why I waited." Morrison gestured toward the church across the street. "I have a proposition, unusual but legal. Might solve both our problems." Inside the church's small office, Morrison explained. A woman had arrived on yesterday's stage from Cheyenne. She'd come from Philadelphia, running from an arranged marriage to a man of wealth and cruelty. Her family had disowned her but sent money $200 to ensure her proper settlement in the West. She needs a husband, protection, a name that isn't her own. Morrison's eyes were steady. "You need capital to save your ranch. I'm proposing a legal marriage contract." Ezekiel's jaw tightened. "You're asking me to buy a wife?" "I'm asking you to offer safety to a woman in desperate circumstances. In return, she offers you the means to keep your land." Morrison leaned forward. "Both of you are at the end of your rope, son. Sometimes God's providence looks like a business arrangement." Through the office window, Ezekiel saw her. A woman in a plain calico dress stood in the church sanctuary, her back to them. Her hands gripped a worn carpet bag, shoulders hunched as though expecting a blow. "What's her name?" "Sarah Brennan. She's educated, quiet, doesn't ask for much." Morrison paused. "She's not what most men would call handsome, Ezekiel, but she's got dignity, and she's alone." Ezekiel watched her shadow in the doorway. Alone. Yes, he understood that. "I'd like to meet her," he said quietly. Sarah Brennan turned when they entered the sanctuary. Her face was round, her figure substantial beneath the modest dress. But it was her eyes that struck Ezekiel dark and watchful, like a creature that had learned to measure every threat. "Miss Brennan, this is Ezekiel Garrett." Morrison made the introduction with gentle formality. "He's willing to consider the arrangement we discussed." She studied Ezekiel with an intensity that made him straighten his shoulders. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy some internal question, because she gave a small nod. "Mr. Garrett." Her voice was soft but educated, each word precisely shaped. "Reverend Morrison explained my circumstances." "Some?" Ezekiel removed his hat. "You're running from trouble back east. From a man who believes he owns me." She said it without drama, a simple statement of fact. "My family made arrangements. I refused them. They sent me here with enough money to disappear appropriately. $200 and a milk cow," Morrison added. "The cow's already at the livery. Good Jersey, young and healthy." Sarah's hands tightened on her carpet bag. "I understand this is mercenary. Mr. Garrett, I'm offering you resources in exchange for your name and protection. I don't expect affection. I can work. I can cook and clean and manage a household. I won't be a burden beyond the initial transaction." The words were rehearsed. Ezekiel could tell. She'd prepared this speech, steeled herself for rejection or worse. "I'm not a wealthy man, Miss Brennan. I'm barely a solvent one. I don't want wealth. I want distance from Philadelphia and a legal bond that prevents my family from reclaiming me." She met his eyes. "Can you offer that?" Behind her careful control, Ezekiel saw fear. Not of him, of something far worse. He thought of his empty cabin, his dwindling herd, the bank notice promising ruin. He thought of Emma's grave and the crushing loneliness of 2 years spent talking to ghosts. "Yes, ma'am, I can offer that." Morrison produced the marriage license within the hour. Sarah signed with a steady hand, her penmanship elegant despite the trembling Ezekiel noticed in her fingers. Her script was educated. Each letter carefully formed the handwriting of someone who'd been taught by expensive tutors. The ceremony was brief. No witnesses except Morrison, no music or flowers. Just words spoken in an empty church while autumn light slanted through plain windows. When Morrison pronounced them married, Sarah didn't look at Ezekiel. She stared at her new signature on the license, Sarah Garrett. The ride back to the ranch was silent except for the wagon's creaking and the rustle of dried leaves skittering across the road. Sarah sat rigid on the bench, her carpet bag clutched in her lap. Ezekiel didn't attempt conversation. What was there to say to a woman you'd married for money and a milk cow as they crested the final hill? His ranch came into view, modest cabin, weathered barn, empty corrals stretching toward distant mountains. Sarah's face revealed nothing, but her grip on the bag tightened. "It's not much," Ezekiel said. "It's mine now," she replied quietly. "That's more than I had this morning." The cabin was smaller than Sarah had imagined, but cleaner. A single room with a sleeping loft accessible by ladder, a cast-iron stove dominating one corner, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs. Everything spoke of a man living alone, functional, spare, without softness or decoration. Ezekiel helped her down from the wagon, his touch brief and impersonal. "I'll show you around." The tour was awkward. He pointed out the root cellar outside, the kitchen pump that sometimes froze in deep winter, the woodpile that would need restocking before snow. Inside, he demonstrated the stove's temperamental draft, the proper way to trim the coal oil lamp's wick. Where Emma's, he paused where the dishes were kept. Sarah noticed the photograph on the mantel, a young woman with soft features and hopeful eyes, her hand resting on the back of a chair. Emma. Certainly. Beautiful in the way Sarah had never been. "She was lovely," Sarah said quietly. Ezekiel's face closed. "She was." He moved toward the door. "I'll fetch your bag and see to the horses. There's a bedroom through that door. Sleeping loft's where I've been staying." When he returned with her carpet bag, the sun was setting, the cabin filled with amber light that softened the harsh edges of their situation. Ezekiel moved to the stove, his movements efficient as he built up the fire. "You must be hungry. I can make supper." "I can help." "No need." He didn't look at her. "You've had a long day." Sarah sat at the table, feeling useless, watching him work. He fried salt pork in a cast-iron skillet, mixed cornmeal with water for Johnny cakes. His hands were large and scarred, capable. A working man's hands that knew their purpose. They ate in near silence. The food was plain but filling. Sarah found herself grateful for the simplicity in Philadelphia. Meals had been elaborate performances, each course a test of proper behavior. "It's good," she offered. "Thank you." Ezekiel nodded, still not meeting her eyes. "There's coffee if you want it. Real coffee, not substitutes." "That would be nice." He poured from a battered tin pot, the smell rich and comforting. Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm cup, searching for something to say that wouldn't sound foolish or presumptuous. "How long have you had the ranch?" 10 years. Built the cabin myself. First 2 years living in a dugout while I worked. He stared into his coffee. Emma came when the cabin was finished. We had 2 good years before. He didn't finish. Sarah didn't press. Darkness settled fully. Ezekiel lit the coal oil lamp, adjusting the flame until it burned steady. The small circle of light made the cabin feel even more intimate, isolating them from the vast emptiness outside. About sleeping arrangements. His voice was gruff with discomfort. The bedroom's yours. I'll take the barn. There's a cot out there, and the horses provide heat. Sarah's throat tightened. Mr. Garrett. Ezekiel. Ezekiel. She forced herself to meet his eyes. You don't have to sleep in the barn. This is your home. I can take the loft. Or, no. His tone was firm, but not unkind. You're my wife now. Legal and proper. That means you get the bedroom and the privacy that comes with it. I won't have you thinking. I won't have you afraid. The kindness in his words cracked something in Sarah's carefully maintained composure. In Philadelphia, her father had lectured her about wifely duties and submission. Her former fiancé had made explicit his expectations of ownership. But this rough rancher, this man who'd married her for money, was offering her dignity. Thank you, she whispered. After he left for the barn, Sarah stood alone in the bedroom. It was small, just enough space for a rope bed with a corn husk mattress, a simple dresser, a wooden peg for hanging clothes. The window looked out toward the barn where a faint light showed Ezekiel settling in. She unpacked her carpetbag slowly. 2 spare dresses, undergarments carefully mended, the tortoiseshell hair combs her grandmother had given her. At the bottom, wrapped in cloth, was the daguerreotype of her family. She'd scratched out the faces in a moment of rage aboard the train west, and her Bible, pressed flowers marking passages her mother had loved. At the wash basin, Sarah poured water from the pitcher. The tin basin was cold, the water colder. She washed her face and hands with the lye soap, harsh but clean. In the window's reflection, lit by the coal oil lamp, she saw herself clearly: round face, heavy body, plain features that had disappointed her father and disgusted her fiancé. Not what men want, Charles had said the night she'd refused him. You should be grateful I'm willing to overlook your deficiencies. Outside, Ezekiel's shadow passed across the barn door. Sarah's hand moved to the bedroom door, almost touching the simple wooden latch. She wanted to open it, to call out to him, to say thank you properly, to tell him that his kindness was the first she'd known from a man in years. But fear held her back. Fear of misunderstanding, of presumption, of hoping for something that wasn't part of their bargain. Instead, she locked the door not from fear of him, but from shame of herself, from the certainty that if he saw her clearly, he would regret this arrangement. Through the door, into the darkness, she whispered what she couldn't say to his face. I'm not what men want. That's why I ran. In the main room, the coal oil lamp burned lower. The stove ticked as it cooled. And in the barn, Ezekiel Garrett lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling, wondering what he'd gotten himself into. But neither of them, in that long first night, understood yet what they'd truly found. Sarah woke to silence. For a confused moment, she didn't recognize the rough cabin walls, the corn husk mattress beneath her. Then memory returned: the wedding, the journey, Ezekiel's kindness. She was married. She was safe. She was in Wyoming territory, as far from Philadelphia as she could manage. Dawnlight filtered through the single window. She dressed quickly in the cold air, braiding her hair with practiced efficiency. When she emerged from the bedroom, the main room was empty, but the stove was warm. Ezekiel had already been inside, stoking the fire before heading out to work. Sarah found the gesture both thoughtful and isolating. He was maintaining careful distance, leaving her space but also leaving her alone. She explored the cabin properly in daylight. Everything was meticulously organized, dishes stacked neatly, tools hung on pegs, firewood stacked with precision. But there was no decoration, no comfort, nothing that spoke of a home rather than a shelter. On a shelf near the stove, she discovered a small pine-wood box. Inside were recipe cards, dozens of them, written in a woman's careful hand. Emma's recipes. Sarah touched them reverently: dried apple pie, sourdough starter instructions, remedies for colic and fever, a life documented in penciled notes on paper scraps. She selected the biscuit recipe and set to work. When Ezekiel returned an hour later, stamping snow from his boots, the smell of fresh biscuits filled the cabin. He stopped in the doorway, surprise evident on his weathered face. "I hope you don't mind," Sarah said quickly. "I found the recipe box and thought, Emma's biscuits." His voice was rough. "I haven't. It's been a while. If it's too painful, I can—" "No." He moved to the table, sitting heavily. "It's good. She'd have wanted her recipes used." He paused. "She'd have liked you." They ate in more comfortable silence than the night before. The biscuits weren't perfect. Sarah had misjudged the oven temperature, but they were edible. Ezekiel ate 3. "I'd like to help with the ranch work," Sarah said as she cleared the plates. "I'm not skilled, but I can learn." Ezekiel studied her over his coffee cup. "It's hard work. Physical. I'm stronger than I look." Something shifted in his expression. Respect, perhaps, or curiosity. "All right, we'll start with the chickens." The morning became a lesson in frontier survival. Ezekiel showed her the hen house, how to scatter feed corn, where the nesting boxes were arranged. Sarah collected eggs carefully, placing them in a tin basket with a wire handle. The chickens seemed suspicious of her, but she spoke to them softly until they accepted her presence. "You're good with them," Ezekiel observed. "Patient. I raised canaries in Philadelphia. Birds understand gentleness." Next came fence mending. The north pasture needed repair before he could rotate the cattle. Ezekiel handed Sarah work gloves, worn leather, far too large for her hands, and demonstrated how to stretch barbed wire without losing tension. The work was harder than Sarah anticipated. The wire was unforgiving, the posts heavy. She struggled with the tools, her city-soft hands unused to such labor. But she didn't complain. Each time she fumbled, she tried again. "Barbed wire's new technology," Ezekiel explained as they worked. "Expensive, but it works better than rail fencing. Holds cattle without constant maintenance." Sarah gripped the wire carefully, pulling as he'd shown her, but the barb caught her palm, tearing through the loose glove. Pain flared sharp and immediate. "Damn." Ezekiel saw the blood. "Let me see." She tried to pull away. "It's nothing. It's not nothing." His voice was firm. He took her hand gently, examining the wound. Blood welled from a deep scratch across her palm. Without hesitation, he tore a strip from the bottom of his own shirt, wrapping her hand with surprising tenderness. Their eyes met. Sarah's breath caught at his nearness, at the care in his calloused fingers. This was their first real physical contact, more intimate than any wedding ceremony. "You should have said the gloves didn't fit," he said quietly. "I wanted to be useful." "You are useful, but not if you injure yourself trying to prove it." He finished tying the bandage. "We'll find you proper gloves in town." By afternoon, he had her help move the cattle to the north pasture. Sarah had ridden before controlled, supervised rides through Philadelphia's parks. But Clover, the gentle 15-year-old mare Ezekiel provided, was different. This was riding with purpose, working an animal rather than performing for society. "She's patient," Ezekiel said of the mare. "Won't spook easy. Just sit steady and trust her." Sarah did. And when they had the 14 cattle moved and secured, when she sat on Clover watching the herd settle, she felt something unfamiliar: competence. Pride in work done. That evening, as Sarah prepared supper, ham and beans from the recipe box, Ezekiel sat at the table studying a week-old newspaper. She noticed his eyes moving slowly across the words, his lips forming sounds silently. "Reading is hard for me," he admitted when he caught her watching. Never had much schooling. Emma used to read to me evenings. Sarah set down her spoon. I could read to you, if you'd like. Or, she hesitated. I could teach you. Letters. Words. I taught Sunday school back home. I'm patient. Ezekiel's expression was unreadable. You do that. We're partners now, aren't we? Partners help each other. Something eased in his posture. I'd appreciate that. Thank you. After supper? By lamplight. Sarah began simply. She wrote letters on paper scraps, pronounced them clearly, watched him trace them with a pencil. His hands, so capable with tools and animals, struggled with the delicate work of forming letters, but he persisted. You're a good teacher, he said after an hour. Patient, like you said. And you're a good student, determined. They sat in comfortable quiet, the lamp casting warm light, the stove crackling softly. Outside, wind moved through bare trees. Inside, something fragile was building. Can I ask you something? Sarah's voice was tentative. Go ahead. Emma, what happened? Ezekiel's jaw tightened, but he didn't deflect. Childbirth. Baby came early. Too small. Neither of them lasted the night. His voice was flat with old pain. Doctor said sometimes it just happens. Nothing anyone could have done. I'm sorry. 2 years ago now. Feels like yesterday and forever at the same time. He looked at her directly. What about you? What are you really running from? Sarah's hands twisted in her lap. My father. He's a banker in Philadelphia. Important man. Wealthy family. He arranged my marriage to Charles Whitmore Steel Fortune. Old money. I was supposed to be grateful. But you weren't. Charles was cruel. Not with fists, but with words. He made it clear I was deficient. Too heavy, too plain, too educated for a woman. He would correct these flaws after marriage. Her voice hardened. I refused him publicly at a dinner party. The scandal was considerable. My family disowned me. They sent me west with money to disappear properly. So we both lost everything once, Ezekiel said quietly. Yes. The fire popped. The lamp flickered. Sarah gathered her courage. Ezekiel, could this be a real marriage someday? He was silent so long she regretted asking. Then he stood, moved to the window, stared out at darkness. I don't know, he finally said, but I think we could try to find out. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was honest. And for Sarah, honesty was more valuable than any promise. 6 weeks passed like water, finding its course gradually, naturally, carving new channels in their lives. Sarah transformed the cabin in small ways that accumulated into something remarkable. Flour sacks became curtains, the Pride of the West mill logo still visible on the fabric but softened by careful hemming. She planted herbs in tin cans along the windowsill, sage, thyme, rosemary from seeds traded with a passing peddler. The shelves that had stood empty now lined up with preserves, peach, tomato, green beans in mason jars, their contents glowing like amber in lamplight. The cabin, which had been merely functional, became a home. Ezekiel noticed every change. He said little, but Sarah caught him running his hand along the new curtains, pausing to smell the herbs, counting the preserve jars with something like wonder in his eyes. Once, she found him sitting at the table simply looking around the room, and when he saw her watching, he'd said quietly, "It's been a long time since this place felt alive." Their work together fell into rhythm. Sarah learned the cattle's patterns, could identify each of the 14 by sight. She mastered the temperamental stove, coaxing heat from green wood when the seasoned supply ran low. Ezekiel, in turn, worked through his reading lessons with determined focus, tracing letters each evening until his hand cramped. They were building something. Neither said it aloud, but both felt it. On a crisp October morning, Ezekiel announced they needed supplies from town.
Sarah's stomach tightened with anxiety. She hadn't been back since the wedding day. But she nodded and changed into her better dress, pinning her hair more carefully than usual. The ride to town took 2 hours. Ezekiel kept the wagon at a steady pace, Old Buck plodding along the rutted road. Yellow leaves drifted across their path, and the mountains in the distance had received their first dusting of snow. "People will talk," Ezekiel said as they approached the outskirts. "Small towns feed on gossip. I know. Just wanted you prepared." Main Street was busier than Sarah remembered. Saturday shopping day brought ranchers and their families into town. As Ezekiel helped her down from the wagon, Sarah felt eyes turning their direction. Whispers followed them like shadows. Inside Morrison's general store, Mrs. Morrison looked up from her counter with undisguised curiosity. Her gaze traveled over Sarah's figure with the critical assessment women reserve for other women. "Mrs. Garrett." The title came with barely concealed skepticism. "How domestic of you to join your husband today." Sarah lifted her chin. "I needed fabric for winter sewing, and coffee, if you have fresh stock." "We do." Mrs. Morrison's smile was thin. "Though I'm surprised Mr. Garrett can afford luxuries these days. Times being what they are." Ezekiel, who'd been examining harness leather, turned slowly. "My finances are my own business, Mrs. Morrison, and my wife will have what she needs." The store went quiet. 2 other customers paused mid-conversation. Mrs. Morrison flushed. "Of course. I meant no offense." "Then give none." Ezekiel's voice was level but carried weight. "Sarah, pick what you need. Put it on my account." Sarah selected carefully calico fabric, thread, real coffee beans. When Mrs. Morrison tallied the cost with obvious reluctance, Ezekiel paid in cash, counting out the bills with deliberate precision. He'd sold 3 calves last week, Sarah knew, getting enough to cover expenses through winter. Outside. Sarah exhaled shakily. "Thank you for defending me. You're my wife, legal and proper." He loaded their purchases into the wagon. "Anyone who questions that can address me directly." The ride home felt different. Sarah sat straighter, less burdened by shame. Whatever the townspeople thought, Ezekiel had claimed her publicly. That mattered more than she'd expected. As October deepened toward November, winter preparations consumed their days. The woodpile needed restocking, a massive undertaking that would determine whether they froze or survived. Ezekiel hauled logs from the timber claim on the mountain. Sarah helped stack and split what she could manage. "Here." Ezekiel handed her a smaller axe one afternoon. "Try splitting these smaller pieces. Like this." He demonstrated precise strikes, using the wood's grain to advantage. Sarah took the axe, positioned herself as he'd shown, and swung. The blade stuck halfway through. She tried again, and again. On the 4th attempt, the wood split cleanly, pieces flying apart with satisfying force. "Ha!" The laugh burst out before she could stop it. "I did it!" Ezekiel grinned, the first full smile she'd seen from him. "You did. Natural talent." They worked together through the afternoon, Sarah splitting while Ezekiel stacked. She was clumsy still, missing more often than hitting clean. But slowly, her pile grew. Then her axe stuck deep in a stubborn log. Sarah pulled, twisted, couldn't free it. "It's wedged." Ezekiel stepped behind her, his arms coming around to grip the handle above her hands. "Pull when I lift." "Ready." She nodded, hyper-aware of his chest against her back, his breath warm near her ear. They pulled together, and the axe came free with sudden force. Neither moved away immediately. "Sarah," his voice was low. She turned within the circle of his arms. They stood frozen, inches apart, both suddenly aware of boundaries being crossed. His eyes searched hers, asking a question he didn't voice. "I'm not afraid of you," she whispered. "I want you to know that." "I know." His hand lifted,
hesitated, then gently touched her cheek. I'm more afraid of disappointing you. You couldn't. The moment stretched, fragile and precious. Then Ezekiel stepped back, clearing his throat. We should finish before dark. But something had shifted. The rest of the afternoon, they moved around each other with new awareness, careful and wondering. That evening, Sarah read aloud from the newspaper while Ezekiel carved a broken chair leg. She chose an article about railroad expansion, then one about a scientific expedition to Yellowstone. When she finished, she looked up to find him watching her instead of his work. What? You have a good voice for reading, clear, makes the words sound important. They are important. The world is changing. Out here, it feels like the world forgot us. He set down his knife. But listening to you, I remember there's more than just survival. Sarah closed the newspaper carefully. Would you like your lesson now? They moved to the table. She'd written simple sentences on paper scraps, words he'd been practicing. Ezekiel read slowly, sounding out each one. When he finished a complete sentence without help, the horse ran fast over the hill. Pride lit his weathered face. I read it. Whole thing. You did? Sarah's hand rested on the table near his. You're learning quickly. His finger traced the letters he'd written. Having a good teacher helps. Their hands were close, almost touching. Sarah's pulse quickened. This was dangerous territory, wanting more than their bargain promised. But she couldn't deny the pull. The way her heart lifted when he smiled. The security she felt in his presence. Ezekiel's hand covered hers. Just rested there. Warm and rough and real. Sarah. A log in the stove shifted, cracking loudly. They both startled, the moment broken. But Ezekiel didn't move his hand. I'm glad you're here, he said finally. I want you to know that whatever this is, whatever it becomes, I'm glad. Sarah turned her hand over, lacing her fingers through his. So am I. Outside, the first flakes of winter snow began to fall. Inside, two lonely people sat together in lamplight, holding hands across a rough wooden table, neither quite brave enough yet to name what they were building. But they both felt it growing slow and steady, like roots finding purchase in rocky soil, something that might, given time and care, become strong enough to weather any storm. Early November brought the first real storm. The sky had been threatening for days, heavy gray clouds banking against the mountains, the air carrying that peculiar stillness that precedes violence. Ezekiel studied the horizon at dawn, his expression grim. Storm's coming. Big one. He pulled on his heavy coat. I need to check the line shack. Make sure the cattle can shelter there if it hits hard. Should be back by afternoon. Sarah felt unease prickle along her spine. Can't it wait? No. If they're caught out in the open? He didn't finish, but she understood. Losing cattle now would finish them. I'll be careful. Promise. She watched him ride out on Clover, leading the pack horse. The wind was already picking up, whipping his coat around him. He turned once to wave, and then the landscape swallowed him. By midday, snow began. Not the gentle flakes of earlier weeks, but driving sheets that turned the world white. Sarah stuffed rags around the windows as Ezekiel had taught her, banked the stove high, brought in extra firewood from the pile. The wind howled around the cabin's corners, finding every gap and crack. Afternoon passed, then evening. The storm intensified into a screaming fury. Sarah lit the coal oil lamp early, watching its flame dance with each gust that found its way inside. She told herself Ezekiel had sheltered at the line shack. He was experienced. He knew the land. He'd wait out the worst and return tomorrow. But as darkness fell completely and the temperature plummeted, Her worry crystallized into fear. The line shack was 3 miles north. In this storm, 3 miles might as well be 30. She made coffee she didn't drink, paced the small cabin, stared at the door as though will alone could bring him through it. The patchwork quilt Emma had made lay folded on the bed. Sarah pulled it around her shoulders, seeking comfort from a dead woman's handiwork. By 10 o'clock, she couldn't bear it any longer. Sarah dressed in layers, 2 skirts, her heaviest shawl, Ezekiel's spare coat over everything. She found the rope he kept coiled in the barn, tied one end to the porch post, testing the knot 3 times. The coal oil lantern had a metal shield for wind. She lit it carefully, adjusted the wick. What she was about to do was foolish. She knew that. The smart thing was to wait, to trust Ezekiel's competence. But sitting in safety while he might be dying in the snow, that was impossible. The storm hit her like a physical blow when she stepped outside. Wind tore at her clothes, drove snow into her eyes and mouth. The lantern's flame guttered wildly behind its shield. She could barely see 5 feet ahead. Sarah gripped the rope and moved forward. The barn was only 30 yards from the cabin, but it took forever to reach. Inside, Old Buck and the remaining horses shifted nervously. She considered taking a horse, but she'd never ridden in conditions like this. On foot, with the rope as guide, she had a chance. From the barn, she struck out north, following the fence line Ezekiel had shown her. The rope played out behind her, a lifeline to survival. Wind screamed, snow blinded, cold bit through every layer, finding skin, stealing heat. She walked and walked. Time became meaningless. Her hands were numb on the lantern handle. Her face hurt from the cold, but she kept moving, because stopping meant death for her and possibly for Ezekiel. The fence turned east. She followed it. Her legs were leaden weights. The lantern dimmed fuel running low. She shook it, coaxed a little more light. Then, impossibly, she saw him. Ezekiel was hunched against a fence post, Clover standing over him protectively. The horse whinnied when Sarah approached. Ezekiel didn't move. "No, no, no." Sarah dropped to her knees beside him. His face was gray, lips blue, eyes half closed. "Ezekiel, can you hear me?" He stirred slightly. "Emma, it's Sarah. Can you stand? We have to get you home." "Cold. So cold." With strength she didn't know she possessed, Sarah got him upright. He was heavy, disoriented, barely able to support his own weight. She got his arm around her shoulders, hers around his waist. "Follow the fence," she told him, told herself. Just follow the fence. They stumbled through the storm. Ezekiel's weight dragged at her. Several times they nearly fell. The lantern went out, leaving them in total darkness except for the barely visible fence posts. Sarah's rope lifeline was long gone. She'd traveled far beyond its reach. She didn't know how long they walked. Hours, maybe, or minutes that felt like hours. The storm disoriented everything. But somehow, miraculously, the barn loomed out of the whiteness. Inside, Sarah got Ezekiel onto the hay pile. He was shaking violently, his skin like ice. She ran to the cabin for blankets, the quilt, anything warm, built up the stove until it roared, struggled to get his wet clothes off, wrapping him in dry blankets. His teeth chattered. "Sarah, shouldn't have. Come. Hush. Save your strength." She made willow bark tea, remembering Emma's recipe for fever, coaxed him to drink, though he barely swallowed. His skin was still too cold. She piled every blanket they owned on top of him, stoked the fire higher. Around midnight, fever set in. His body's desperate attempt to warm itself turned into burning heat. Ezekiel thrashed, delirious, calling out in fragments. "Emma, the baby, save the baby!" Sarah's heart broke. She bathed his face with cool cloths, held his hand, spoke steadily. "I'm here. You're safe. I'm here. Can't lose you again. Not again. You won't. I promise. Sarah." His eyes opened, unfocused. Sarah, are you real? I'm real. I'm right here. Don't leave. Please don't leave. Never. She gripped his hand tighter. I'll never leave. He quieted somewhat after that, but the fever raged on. Sarah pulled the chair close to his bedside, maintaining her vigil. She dozed in fits, jerking awake whenever he moved or cried out. Outside, the storm slowly spent its fury. Dawn came gray and exhausted through frost-covered windows. The cabin was dim, the stove burning low. Sarah was slumped in the chair, Ezekiel's hand still clasped in hers. Her head rested on the edge of the bed, her breathing deep with exhausted sleep. Ezekiel woke to this sight. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. Light caught in her dark hair, touched the curve of her cheek pressed against rough blankets. Her hand held his even in sleep, as though afraid he'd slip away. Memory returned in pieces. The storm, getting disoriented, the crushing cold. Then Sarah's voice cutting through the darkness, her impossible presence in the blizzard, her strength getting him home. She'd risked everything, for him. The realization settled into his chest, heavy and warm. This woman he'd married for money and convenience had walked into a killing storm because she couldn't bear the thought of him dying alone. She'd sat up all night nursing him through fever, refusing to leave his side. "Sarah," he whispered. She stirred, lifted her head. Her eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion, her face pale. But when she saw him awake and clear-eyed, relief flooded her features. "Ezekiel, thank God." She touched his forehead. "The fever broke. How do you feel?" "Like I got trampled." His voice was rough. "You came out in the storm." "Yes. You could have died. So could you." He struggled to sit up. She helped him, propping pillows behind his back. The movement cost him dizziness swept through, but he fought it down. "Sarah, why you could have stayed safe, waited for the storm to pass." She looked at him steadily, all pretense stripped away by exhaustion and fear. "Because you're my husband. The real kind, not just on paper." The words hung between them, honest and irrevocable. Ezekiel's hand tightened on hers. When what? When did this become real for you?" Sarah's eyes filled. "I think from the first night, when you gave me the bedroom and slept in the barn, when you treated me with dignity I'd never known. But I was too afraid to admit it, too afraid you'd married me out of desperation and nothing more." "I did marry you out of desperation," he said quietly. "But Sarah, somewhere along the way, learning the ranch together, reading lessons, splitting wood and building a life, I stopped seeing you as a transaction. You became—" He struggled for words. "You became the reason I get up in the morning, the reason this place feels like home again." And a tear slipped down her cheek. "Really, really." He pulled her hand to his chest, over his heart. "You saved my life last night. But the truth is, you've been saving it for weeks. I just didn't have the courage to say so." Sarah leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. They stayed like that, breathing together, the morning light strengthening around them. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the world clean and white and new. "We're a mess," Ezekiel said finally. "Both of us broken when we started. Maybe that's why we fit." Sarah's smile was tentative but real. Two broken people make something whole. "I like that." He touched her face, thumb brushing away the tear track. "I love you, Sarah. I should have said it sooner, but I'm saying it now. I love you too." The words came easily, true and simple. "So much it terrifies me." They sat together in the quiet cabin, the stove crackling, dawn light painting everything gold. Two people who'd married as strangers, worked as partners, and finally, acknowledged what had grown between them. Love, real and earned and worth every risk. The week following the storm brought a tentative peace to the ranch. Ezekiel recovered his strength slowly, and Sarah refused to let him work at full capacity until she was satisfied the fever's effects had passed completely. They moved around each other with new awareness. Love spoken aloud changed everything, made ordinary moments precious. Their morning routine became a ritual Sarah treasured. She'd wake to find Ezekiel already up, building the fire. He'd grind coffee beans in the hand mill while she mixed biscuit dough. They'd eat together as dawn broke over the mountains, planning the day's work, sharing quiet conversation that felt more intimate than any grand declaration. "I need to ride to town for mail," Ezekiel said one Saturday morning. "Reverend Morrison holds it at the church. Haven't checked in over a month. I'll come with you." He smiled, the expression still new enough to catch her breath. "I'd like that." The ride to town was cold but clear. Snow blanketed the landscape, transforming the harsh terrain into something almost beautiful. Sarah sat close to Ezekiel on the wagon bench, and when he draped a blanket over both their laps, she leaned against his shoulder. At the church, Reverend Morrison greeted them with knowing eyes. "Good to see you both. And together, I notice. Things working out." Then, "Yes, sir," Ezekiel said. "Better than I expected." "Better than either of us expected," Sarah added. Morrison handed over a small bundle of mail, mostly bills and a farming circular. But at the bottom was an envelope that made Sarah's blood run cold. Expensive linen paper, wax seal, her name written in formal script, Mrs. Sarah Brennan, not Garrett, Brennan. Her hands trembled as she took it. The return address was a Philadelphia law firm, Whitmore, Pierce and Associates. "Sarah," Ezekiel's voice held concern. "What is it? Can we go home, please?" The ride back was silent. Sarah clutched the unopened letter, dread building with each passing mile. Ezekiel didn't press, but she felt his worry in the tension of his shoulders, the frequent glances he cast her direction. Inside the cabin, Sarah stood by the stove, still holding the envelope. Ezekiel waited, giving her space to speak when ready. "It's from a law firm in Philadelphia," she finally said. "Whitmore, Pierce and Associates." "Whitmore? Your former fiancé? His family's firm?" She broke the wax seal with shaking fingers, unfolded the thick paper. Her eyes scanned the formal legal language, and her worst fears crystallized into reality. "He's coming." Her voice was barely audible. "Charles Whitmore is coming here." "In 10 days." Ezekiel crossed to her in 2 strides. "Let me see." She handed him the letter. He read slowly, struggling with some of the elaborate legal terminology, but the intent was clear. Charles Whitmore III would be arriving in Wyoming Territory to assess the welfare and proper placement of Sarah Brennan, with the intention of retrieving said individual from unsuitable circumstances. Retrieving. Ezekiel's jaw tightened. "Like your property. That's how he sees me. How he's always seen me." Sarah sank into a chair, the weight of her past crushing down. "I have to tell you everything, the whole truth." "All right." She took a breath. "Charles Whitmore is one of the wealthiest men in Philadelphia. Steel fortune, old family name. My father arranged our engagement when I was 20, a business transaction disguised as courtship. Charles was cruel. Not with his fists, but with words. He made it clear I was deficient in every way. Too heavy, too plain, too educated. He said he would correct these flaws after we married." Ezekiel's fists clenched, but he stayed silent. "For 2 years, I tried to make myself acceptable. I barely ate. Trying to lose weight, I pretended ignorance to seem less threatening. I endured his criticisms and his increasingly possessive behavior. But 6 months ago, at a dinner party with both our families present, he made a comment about looking forward to breaking me properly after the wedding." "Jesus, Sarah." I stood up, in front of everyone, and I told him the engagement was over, that I would never marry him, that I'd rather die alone than spend one day as his wife. Her voice strengthened with the memory. The scandal was enormous. My father was furious I'd ruined important business connections. Charles was humiliated. He told everyone I was mentally unstable, that I'd been led astray by radical literature and feminine hysteria. So your family sent you away. Disowned me, technically, but they gave me money to disappear properly, far enough away that I couldn't embarrass them further. I was supposed to vanish into obscurity. She looked at Ezekiel directly. I never told you because I was ashamed. I thought if you knew how publicly I'd failed, how completely my own family rejected me, I'd what? Think less of you. He knelt beside her chair. Sarah, you broke free from a man who wanted to own you. That takes more courage than anything I've ever done. But now he's coming, and Charles doesn't accept defeat. He'll try to convince me to return, or... She couldn't finish the thought. Or what? Or he'll try to prove I'm unfit, have the marriage annulled on grounds of my mental instability. He has money, lawyers, influence. We have each other. Ezekiel's voice was firm. We have each other, and a legal marriage, and the truth. Sarah's eyes filled. Ezekiel, you don't understand what you're up against. Charles is powerful. He could make things very difficult for you. For the ranch, I should leave. Spare you the confrontation. I could go to California, or... No. But... No. Sarah. He gripped her hands. You're my wife. Legal and true. That letter can call you Brennan all it wants. But you're Sarah Garrett. You're staying here. With me. She wanted to believe him, but doubt crept in like cold through poorly chinked walls. What if I'm not enough reason to fight? What if when you see him, his money, his power, everything he can offer, you realize you could never compete? The question hung between them, exposing the fear she'd been carrying since the day they married. Ezekiel was quiet so long she thought she'd lost him. Is that what you think? His voice was low. That I'd measure myself against some rich bastard and find myself wanting, I think you're a good man. And I think good men sometimes realize they've taken on more trouble than they bargained for. Ezekiel stood, walked to the window, stared out at the snow-covered land. Sarah watched his back, her heart breaking in slow motion. Then he turned. When Emma died, I thought I was done. Thought I'd work this land until it killed me or I sold it, whichever came first. I was surviving, not living. Then you came. You, with your city hands and your education and your quiet strength. You learned to split wood and mend fence, and you walked into a blizzard to save my life. He crossed back to her. You think I'd give that up because some wealthy man shows up claiming he owns you, Sarah? You're not a prize to be won or property to retrieve. You're my partner, my wife. And I don't give a damn how much money he has, he doesn't have you. I do. If you'll have me. Sarah stood, the letter still clutched in her hand. She looked at it, the expensive paper, the gilt-edged letterhead, the formal language designed to intimidate. Then she walked to the cast-iron stove and opened the door. He has no claim on me, she said clearly. You do, if you'll have me. She dropped the letter into the flames. They watched it curl and blacken, expensive linen paper turning to ash. The wax seal melted, running like blood, then disappeared. The formal words dissolved into nothing. When Sarah turned back, Ezekiel was there. He pulled her into his arms, not tentatively, not carefully, but with the full strength of his conviction. She buried her face against his chest, feeling his heart beat strong and steady beneath her cheek. We'll face him together, he murmured into her hair. Whatever he says, whatever he threatens, together. Together, she agreed. They stood like that as the letter finished burning, as the stove consumed the last physical link to her past. Outside, winter pressed against the windows, but inside, wrapped in each other's arms. They were warm. The fight wasn't over. In 10 days, Charles Whitmore would arrive with his money and his lawyers and his assumption of ownership. But Sarah and Ezekiel would meet him not as desperate strangers clinging to a business arrangement, but as husband and wife who'd chosen each other fully. "I love you," Sarah whispered. "I love you too." Ezekiel's arms tightened. "And I'm not letting you go. Not to him, not to anyone. You understand?" "I understand." The coffee in the pot had gone cold. The breakfast dishes still needed washing. There was work waiting. Always work on a ranch. But for this moment, they simply held each other, gathering strength for the battle ahead, because love, real love, was worth fighting for. 10 days passed like a held breath. Sarah and Ezekiel prepared for the confrontation with quiet determination. She cleaned the cabin thoroughly, set out Emma's good china that hadn't been used in years, baked bread from the best flour, not to impress Charles, but to show him she'd built something worth defending. Ezekiel worked the ranch with focused intensity, repairing fence, tending cattle, chopping wood. He didn't speak much about the coming encounter, but Sarah felt his resolve in every deliberate action. He was building his own armor not of wealth or education, but of honest work and earned dignity. On the 10th day, the carriage arrived. Sarah saw it first from the kitchen window, a black lacquered vehicle with brass fittings, pulled by matched bay horses, utterly incongruous on the rough frontier road. Her stomach clenched, but she squared her shoulders and called to Ezekiel in the barn. They stood together on the porch as the carriage stopped. The driver, a hired man from town, climbed down to open the door. Charles Whitmore III emerged like a figure from another world. He was exactly as Sarah remembered: tall, aristocratic features, perfectly tailored wool frock coat, silk cravat held with a gold pin, watch chain glinting at his vest. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, impossibly impractical for Wyoming mud. Everything about him screamed wealth, power, Eastern refinement. Behind him came Sheriff Dawson from town, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Mr. Garrett, Mrs. Garrett, Mr. Whitmore here has some legal concerns about Mrs. Garrett's welfare. Asked me to accompany him official-like." "Sheriff," Ezekiel's voice was level, "this is private property. What's your business here?" Charles stepped forward before Dawson could answer. "My business, Mr. Garrett, is with Miss Brennan. If you'd be so kind as to allow us a private conversation." "It's Mrs. Garrett," Sarah said clearly, "and anything you have to say can be said in front of my husband." Charles's smile was cold. "Sarah, how rustic you've become." His eyes traveled over the cabin with obvious disdain. "Surely you don't intend to continue this charade. I've come to take you home. This is my home. This," Charles gestured at the modest cabin, "the rough-hewn porch. You call this a home, Sarah? You were raised in a mansion with 12 bedrooms. You attended finishing school. You've read Wordsworth and studied French. And now you're playing farm wife in a hovel." "It's not a hovel," Ezekiel said quietly. "It's a ranch, built with honest work." Charles turned his attention to Ezekiel for the first time, assessment calculated and cutting. "Yes, the rancher. Tell me, Mr. Garrett, what exactly did you pay for my fiancée? Or was she offered as some sort of charitable arrangement?" "She's not your fiancée. She's my wife. A marriage of convenience, from what I understand. Hardly binding in the eyes of civilized society." Charles pulled papers from his coat. "I've brought annulment documents. Sarah can sign them. We'll compensate you for any expenses incurred, and this unfortunate episode can be forgotten." Sarah felt Ezekiel tense beside her, but he remained silent, letting her speak. "There will be no annulment, Charles. Don't be absurd. Look at yourself." His voice dripped condescension. "You've lost weight, clearly not eating properly. Your hands are rough from manual labor. Your clothes are—" and he waved dismissively. "You're living in poverty with a man who likely can't even read. What kind of future is this?" "A future I chose." Sarah's voice strengthened. "In Philadelphia, I was dying slowly, every day trying to make myself smaller, quieter, less than I was. Here, I'm alive. I work with my hands and sleep soundly at night. I have a partner who respects my mind and values my contributions. That's more than you ever offered. Charles's expression hardened. Partner this? Rancher Sarah, be reasonable. I'm offering you everything: comfort, security, your place in society restored. What can he possibly provide that I cannot? Sarah looked at Ezekiel, his work-roughened hands, his mended shirt, his weathered face. She saw the man who'd given her dignity when she felt worthless, who'd worked beside her building a life, who'd risked his life for cattle and fought through fever calling her name. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his calloused ones. He provides honesty, partnership, love that I don't have to earn through perfect behavior or self-erasure. Love, Charles laughed, the sound sharp and ugly. You think this is love, Sarah? You're confusing gratitude with affection. He gave you shelter when you were desperate. That's not love, that's transaction. Then you don't understand love at all. Sarah lifted Ezekiel's hand to her cheek, pressing it there while looking directly at Charles. These hands built something real. Yours only ever took. He sees me as I am and chooses me anyway. You saw me as something to break and mold into your image of acceptability. I see you're as hysterical as your father claimed. Charles's facade of civility cracked. Sheriff, you're witnessing an obviously disturbed woman being kept in unsuitable conditions by a man who— what education do you have? Mr. Garrett, can you even read? How do you expect to provide for a woman of Sarah's background and breeding? The insults were designed to wound, to make Ezekiel feel small. Sarah felt him stiffen beside her, but his voice remained calm. I can read. My wife taught me, and I provide through honest work on land I own. I don't need a fortune to give Sarah what matters: respect, partnership, a home where she's valued for exactly who she is. How touching. Charles's sneer deepened. Sarah, you're making a mistake. This novelty will wear off. You'll remember what real comfort is, what real society offers. When winter truly sets in, when you're cold and hungry and realize you've traded everything for nothing, you'll regret this. I already lived through a blizzard here, Sarah said. It was terrifying and hard, and I nearly died. But I'd face 100 blizzards before spending one more day pretending to be less than I am to satisfy your ego. Charles studied her, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition that he'd truly lost. Fine. Ruin your life playing pioneer. But understand this, you'll never be welcome in Philadelphia again. Your family won't acknowledge you. The doors that were open to you are closed forever. Good. I never wanted those doors. He turned to leave, then paused. You'll regret this, Sarah. When you're old and broken from hard labor, when this ranch fails and you're left with nothing, you'll remember I offered you a way out. I already have everything I need. Charles climbed into his carriage without another word. Sheriff Dawson tipped his hat awkwardly. Sorry for the trouble. Folks, I'll see him back to town. They watched the carriage disappear down the road, black lacquer incongruous against the white snow. Neither moved until it was completely out of sight. Then Ezekiel turned to Sarah. You chose me. I chose us. Even knowing what it cost your family, your old life, everything you gave up. I didn't give up anything I wanted. She faced him fully. I gave up everything that was killing me. That's not sacrifice. Ezekiel, that's survival. His hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing her cheekbone with infinite tenderness. I'm not eloquent like him. Can't offer you fancy words or comfort. But I can promise you'll never be alone again. Never be less than you are. Never have to apologize for being strong or smart or exactly who you are. That's all I've ever wanted. He kissed her then, not the tentative touches they'd shared before, but deeply, fully, a claiming and a promise. Sarah leaned into it, into him, letting herself believe finally that this was real, that she was safe, that she was home. When they broke apart, Both were breathing hard. "We should go inside," Ezekiel said, "before we scandalize the cattle." Sarah laughed, the sound bright with relief and joy. "The cattle have seen worse." Inside the warm cabin, Ezekiel pulled her close again. "No more running. No more running. This is where I belong. With me. With you." Outside, winter wind moved through bare branches, but inside, holding each other in the cabin, they'd made a home. Sarah and Ezekiel understood they'd won something worth more than any fortune. They'd won each other, and that was everything. 6 months later, spring brought new life to the Garrett Ranch. Sarah's herb garden flourished. The cattle herd had grown to 23, and the cabin echoed with plans for a nursery addition. Reverend Morrison visited often, watching with satisfaction as his unlikely arrangement had blossomed into genuine love. The townspeople who'd once gossiped now respected Sarah's quiet strength and Ezekiel's unwavering devotion. They were invited to barn raisings, church socials, quilting bees. Sarah had found not just a husband, but a community. On their first anniversary, they returned to the church where they'd married as strangers. This time, their vows carried the weight of lived experience, of storms weathered together, of honest work shared, of love earned through choice rather than circumstance. "We were both broken," Sarah said that evening, sitting on their porch watching the sunset. "Society said we weren't enough, you weren't educated enough, I wasn't acceptable enough. But together, we built something they said was impossible." "Sometimes," Ezekiel replied, "the world's opinion matters less than finding one person who sees your worth." Their story proved that dignity isn't found in wealth or status, but in the courage to choose authentic partnership over comfortable pretense. Have you ever felt pressured to accept less than you deserved, whether in relationships, work, or family, simply because others said you should be grateful for what was offered?